extraordinary individual enters the cult field. Last year, all of our lives were affected dramatically by Paul Martin's death. He had come to be our friend, a clinician that we look to, a researcher, someone that day to day was running Wellspring Retreat Center. The loss was monumental for us. Most of all, Paul was a humble, decent human being. And he brought that to his exchanges with all of us. After he died, very shortly after he died, we had a conference, a regional conference in Colorado, and we decided kind of on the spot that we wanted to honor Paul's memory in some way. And we had a memorial program, very ad-lib, and all of us got up and shared our memories of Paul. And it was quite a touching experience for us. But after that was over, there was still a desire to somehow honor Paul and the work that he had done in this field for so many years. And Dubrow-Marshall came to us and said, look, I have this idea. Paul, as regular a guy as he was a writer, a researcher, a clinician, and he wrote beautiful articles. And why don't we start a memorial lecture, a research lecture that makes research accessible, but more than that, it might be clinical work too. Rod's going to tell you more about it. And start that in his name. And that went before the board of the directors, and of course we were enthusiastic, and it was unanimously passed to have it. So it gives me this pleasure to be here at the inauguration of the Dr. Paul Martin Memorial Lecture. And our first presenter for the lecture is Dr. Dubrow-Marshall. And Rod is the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Glamorgan. His principal research is on social influence, including the psychological effects of cultic group membership, influence in organizational settings, and the psychological processes involved in social group identity and prejudice. In 2006, he was awarded the Herbert L. Rosedale Award jointly with Dr. Paul Martin. In their psychological research on undue influence, he co-founded Return in 2004, Return UK, where he is a consultant helping individuals and families who have been adversely affected by destructive cults and other extremist and high-demand manipulative groups, and attends as co-representative of Return UK as correspondent to the General Assembly of FECRIS. So it is my pleasure to turn the podium over to Dr. Rod Dubrow-Marshall.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you, everyone, for being here. In so many ways, I'm very sorry to be delivering this memorial lecture, a memorial lecture in tribute to our dear colleague and friend, Dr. Paul Martin, who, as Lorna said, so very sadly and so very prematurely passed away in August of last year. Paul Martin was so much loved and respected by his family, including Barb, Tim and his brother Steve, who are here today, by his many friends and colleagues in the field, but also by the many, many people whose lives he touched and helped the world over. Late last fall, as Lorna said, I suggested to Michael and Goni that ICSA should consider an annual lecture to honour Paul's memory, his work, and to burn a torch for continuing his legacy, as I know he would so definitely want us to do. So I'm truly honoured and humbled to be paying this inaugural tribute today, as best I can, to one of the real pioneers and giants in the Cultic studies and cult recovery fields, and a dedicated champion of the protection of human rights from abuse. I want to say first of all that Paul was a dedicated weaver of a tapestry he threaded together, the personal and professional, individual, family and community, physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of existence, clinical work and research, as they all related to the complex and, at least early on, much misunderstood and emerging fields of research on cultic influence and the recovery of individuals and families from cultic abuse. Paul's professional background as a psychologist was in experimental psychology, and I remember him telling Linda and I about the subjects of some of his early experiments, which, funnily enough, were with white rats. It was during this time, I think, that Paul and Barb met, and they had their own experience, of course, in a religious cult. But I was often struck, and I often wondered if Paul was too, about how much of a leap there really was between observing rats in a maze, trapped and looking for a way out, and the mystifying, soul-destroying experience for members of destructive cults. As many know, Paul formed Wellspring with Barb back in the 1980s, and with her support and the support of his family and many dedicated co-workers, Wellspring became the leading and pioneer residential treatment facility for survivors of abusive cultic groups and relationships. It was, to put it simply, Paul's calling. It involved a lot of sacrifices for him and his family, and it blended together his commitment to humanity, to God, to the creation of a safe haven, a space for psychological and spiritual recovery, an oasis from which the scared could find solace, the depressed find hope. The location, as some of us know, is literally nowhere, yet from nowhere many found their way back to somewhere. And many in this room today, and far beyond I know, have benefited immensely from the work of Wellspring, the work of Paul, the commitment to Barb, the support of Tim and Steve, and Lois and Phil. And I want to pay a special tribute today to all of Paul's family for your incredible contribution to making and sustaining Wellspring over so many years. This lecture then is about Paul Martin's contribution along so many dimensions, how he created and weaved together the Wellspring model method for treatment of survivors of cults. This was a method which drew on seminal work by Robert J. Lifton, and I remember Paul describing how when he read Lifton he had an epiphany, an aha moment, if you like, which changed, in a sense, the course of his life's work. I know he remained eternally grateful to Robert J. Lifton for his seismic contribution to our understanding of cults and extremism. And he went on to develop a new scale, the Lifton scale, which operationalises the themes of thought reform outlined by Lifton, and is an important method to measure the extent of cultic abuse in group contexts. But what is so special about Paul Martin's approach to work and to his life is that he did not keep these insights to himself. This was not just a private epiphany, but a bold leap of faith which he shared with many others, and which led to a treatment programme and his progenies which have literally saved the lives of many hundreds of people affected by cults worldwide. What is and was unique was that this treatment programme acknowledges at its heart that members of cults have had special and unique experiences. There may be some commonalities with victims of other forms of trauma, such as plane crashes, train crashes, etc., but there are some key and important differences too. Often, as we know, an ideological commitment which has to be understood and worked through as part of the recovery process. Operationalising the key essences of thought reform into a workable treatment programme was a revelatory approach which has arguably changed the field of cult recovery forever. Now, Paul was also a humble and generous man, and I think he would also want me to say that he didn't do this on his own. There was Barb's contribution, and also some other very special colleagues who worked with him on this unique method. Larry Pyle, Ron Burks, there were many others too. Paul was also a great leader of committed practitioners and assembled a wonderful team of colleagues who took forward this unique blend of therapy and psychoeducation over the many years and hundreds of clients. The other thing that Paul decided to do was to measure the success of his treatment programme at Wellspring. As practitioners, we all have that choice in life. Do I subject my work to the scrutiny of science, of research, to see, to put it bluntly, whether the work I'm doing is having any positive effect, or am I just imagining it? I think this was a key commitment of Paul's life too, which was never to be satisfied with good enough, but to strive for better, which was never to be satisfied with just looking at understandings, but formulating new approaches through a detailed analysis of outcomes. So Paul, with others such as Ron and Pete Malinowski, Jody Aronoff, J.B. Whitney and others at Ohio University in Athens, created what became known as the Ohio Battery. This battery, this test packet of instruments, was carefully constructed and administered to clients at intake, to the usually 2-week treatment program, at discharge, and where possible, follow-up with some of the measures was also administered sometime later. The immense benefit of this approach has been, for the first time ever, there is now a large and hugely rich set of data which charts both the harm and the recovery of many hundreds of former cult members. At this point, I should declare my own interest and say that I met Paul at Wellspring for the first time about a decade ago, and he got me hooked, quite literally, I think, with these key questions. Does this data show a specific pattern of harm which is unique to former cult members and which is explained by cultic practices? And second, does this data show an efficacious treatment program at Wellspring, one that is working and which shows that this harm can be treated, but only with a careful application of some of Lifton's key tenets, along with Ron, Pete, Lois Kendall, Carmel Mendros, Linda Olchowski, Linda Dubrow-Marshall and others. We set about trying to answer those and related questions. To be clear then, Paul Martin launched a new field of research and inquiry on cults and recovery, which has caught the imagination and interest of new generations of researchers from across the different continents of our planet. I think our growing research network, made up increasingly of psychologists and other social scientists, have a great deal to thank Paul Martin for, as I think he has inspired so many of us to push the boundaries of this field and of our inquiries. Paul was not afraid to ask the difficult questions, and in part this was because he knew what that prize could be. He was dedicated to stamping out the myth put about by some academicians that cults were mostly benign, that brainwashing was a fiction. Instead, data, hard data, carefully collected and rigorously analysed, held the hope that we, those of us who witnessed the harm in those we helped, could, to use one of Paul's best loved phrases, that we could nail the cult apologists for good. I was honoured. I was honoured to work with Paul on some of the analysis of the data from Wellspring. And as some of you know from the presentations that Paul and I and others have done together at IGSA and elsewhere, we've gone some considerable distance to finding that prize. There is consistent evidence from the Wellspring method that it's highly efficacious and that the harm it treats specifically relates and directly to cultic practice and undue influence. Now, I promised Michael and Goni that this would be a stats-free talk. So I won't delve any deeper into the results today. But to suffice to say that the data analysis from Wellspring shows clearly that there's a specific form of cultic harm which is real and which furthermore is treatable. I remember vividly the excitement that Paul felt and transmitted to others as he worked on this statistical analysis. This was, in a sense, the height of his mission to demonstrate scientifically what he knew as a clinician was the terrible harm that some people suffer in cults. As a consequence, I think I can say that any cult apologists still out there need to watch out as a consequence of what he achieved. So importantly, Paul Martin's research was a standard bearer in the field for providing scientific data that could be used in courtroom settings, and Paul was a frequent expert witness, having many victims of abuse of justice against the groups and individuals that had violated them. In these ways, Paul's published work of more than 15 articles and books raised the bar for others to follow. This included, for example, the seminal 1992 article in Cultic Studies Journal with Michael Ngoni, Art Dole and Geoffrey Wiltrout on the post-cult symptoms using the MCMI, which demonstrated clear treatment effects for the Wellspring model and showed also that dissociation was a key feature of the psychopathology associated with prolonged cult membership. Paul's article in Cultic Studies Journal entitled Pseudo-Identity and the Treatment of Personality Change in Victims of Captivity in Cults drew critical lines of connection with work across disciplines and practice contexts, demonstrating the visceral relevance of cultic studies and the importance and applicability of a recovery model which took time to listen to the experiences of victims and focused on their holistic recovery and development. Paul Martin's published work also includes his chapter in the now seminal volume Recovery from Cults, edited by Michael Ngoni, entitled Post-Cult Recovery, Assessment and Rehabilitation. And of course, there's Paul's book, which so many in the field have used as a guide to follow in working with families and others affected by destructive cults, Cult-Proofing Your Kids. As I've said, Paul Martin's work led to a considerable following of graduate students who worked with him over the years, and with him he presented at numerous conferences. This included American Psychological Association, Ohio Psychological Association, and indeed back in October 2008 he presented with Linda Dubrow-Marshall, Ben Zablocki, Lois Kendall and I as part of a symposium at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion in Kentucky. Paul was not afraid to take his analysis and his work to new audiences, and to audiences who had perhaps been reluctant to admit the problem of cults and the dangers that they can pose. Another example, I think, of Paul Martin as the pioneer, breaking new ground, taking ideas and arguments further and more widely than ever before. It's not surprising, and indeed it was totally deserved, that Paul Martin received not only the John Clark Award from AFF for Distinguished Scholarship in Cultic Studies in 1993, but as long as said, was also the co-recipient of the 2006 IGSA Herbert L. Rosedale Award for Leadership in Preserving and Protecting Individual Freedom. One brilliant example, I think, of Paul Martin's work at its groundbreaking best was his analysis of Lifton's work on thought reform and how this applied to the actions of terrorists and the growth of terrorism post 9/11. Unlike some whose analysis was based on ephemeral classifications or religious dogma, Paul's approach was to systematically apply Lifton's thorough analyses to the latest manifestations of cultic extremism and destruction. From Heaven's Gate in Jonestown to Ground Zero in Abu Ghraib, a clear red line ran through Paul's analysis, which was compelling in his testimony in court cases, including the famous Lee Boyd Malvo trial and the case of Zacharias Moussaoui, dubbed the 20th 9/11 hijacker. Paul's analysis of thought reform and extremism got to the heart of the matter in the most striking way, which was as compelling to the court as it was to conferences, TV audiences, and to those who read his work. I present to you now a diagram which Paul loved to quote and use. I think he indeed used it in conferences in England, where I was present. And it was part of a series he produced to explain the power and the relevance of Lifton's work on thought reform. The graphic, should appear now, was designed by Tim, I believe, and it illustrates viscerally the process of doctrine over person. Doctrine over person, how the cult takes over the person, how the apple is reduced to the apple core. I remember Paul saying that to audiences the world over. Strikingly beautiful and painful imagery. It is the kind of painful truth that has the potential to set you free, and Paul took this analysis to so many who were prepared to listen. In fact, Paul called this use of the analysis of thought reform using Lifton, and then we used to call it Lifton on steroids. This was a classic Paul Martin phrase, I think, and it's really true. And it encapsulated his approach, which was to honourably develop the great work of Robert J. Lifton, but also take it to new heights of explanatory power and accessibility. Glancing at my watch, the difficulty of a lecture like this is that it's hard to distill into 20-some minutes a career and legacy in cult recovery practice and research that was so diverse, wide-ranging, and so life-changing for many people and for the field itself. I was privileged to work with Paul developing the extensive group identity scale with him and Ron Burks, and later using our analysis of the Wellspring data to develop a new theory to explain the social psychology of cults, the totalistic identity theory. And in fact, Paul was due to present with Linda, Dubrow-Marshall and I at the British Psychological Society Social Psychology Conference in September of 2009. I know Paul was delighted, as we were, that we had finally broken into the heady halls of British academe with this left field cult research. And Linda and I genuinely had to force ourselves to present last September without Paul. It was very hard and painful, but we knew it was the right thing to do. And one of the things which struck us at this conference was the extent of research on terrorism and extremism, which drew on similar concepts, and sometimes even on Robert J. Lifton's work, such as terror management theory, but which did not locate itself necessarily within the Cultic studies tradition. So I think Paul Martin advanced the Cultic studies field so far that he's now brought it into dialogue with academic traditions with which we can usefully collaborate. A fruitful dialogue ensues, which I know will expand the range and quality of research in this area for years to come. Indeed, at this conference, the Research Network and also the Mental Health Network together yesterday, we focused on the range of intersections that exist for Cultic studies research with traditional academic disciplines and other fields of study. To build on Paul Martin's legacy of taking cult research to Ohio Psychological Association, American Psychological Association, the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, the British Psychological Society, and I know earlier this year already carrying this torch forward, Greg Salmons, the clinical resident manager at Wellspring, has presented with colleagues on research using the MCMI of the American Counselling Association. So, forgive the pun, but there's a wellspring of insights and ideas, if you like, that have genuinely lit a touch paper across the world. And I know that there are many, some of whom are here today, who spent time at Wellspring as interns, who've taken Paul's legacy to new places, to new horizons. The Wellspring model has effectively been adapted and developed for new populations in new settings and to help new victims of abuse and undue influence. Also the groundbreaking international measurements project led by Carmen Almendros, to which Paul and I contributed, has its initial roots in the Ohio Battery, the use of the GPA with Wellspring clients, which forms part still of the largest data set internationally of former cult members who've been in a residential treatment program. Paul's work at Wellspring, I know, inspired Carmen, myself, Lois Kendall, many others to go out and do research to answer the vital questions. How do cults cause harm, and how can people be helped to recover? So moving forward, as we know we must, Paul Martin has set the standard high that continues to shine a bright beacon of hope for us to follow. Not the rigid, shining path of a cult leader, I hasten to add, but instead the emancipating paths of possibility when the mind is set free to think, is able to analyse without constraint, without fear or favour. Cultic studies, because of Paul Martin, holds out the hope, I think, to be one of the most creative, most pluralist, most liberating research fields in the social sciences. A field with its roots in action research, in practitioner research, which respects the phenomenology of lived experiences, while combining this with the rigorous analysis using carefully designed instruments and experiments. For practitioners, Paul Martin created methods and approaches which were also profoundly liberatory for individuals and families, creating paths to re-empowerment for people, giving hope and adding confidence. Vital, precious ingredients to recovery and personal development. The clinical practice and research went hand in hand for Paul, and I think this is a critical lesson that we should all try to learn. That in our practice daily, whether we're researchers, learners, as we reflect on our work, its impacts, how we can do better. In these ways, research and clinical practice become the yin and yang of the cult recovery and cultic studies fields. Paul Martin's contribution has planted the seeds and the flowering blooms of possibilities for generations to come. And we honour him in this lecture yearly, so that his memory, embodied in so much that we do, continues to blossom and grow for the benefit of all that have been harmed, and for the future of human rights and freedom everywhere. Thank you.
What a beautiful launching for something so important and so Paul. And we are extraordinarily grateful to have Barbara, Tim, and Steve here today. And before we leave, let's all give them a round of applause.